We see the numbers climbing. We have 360 people who have registered, so some people are joining us now as we start. So welcome to everyone. My name is Jenny Cafiso, and I am the director of Canadian Jesuits International. And it's my pleasure to welcome you all to today's webinar that we have called Leave No One Behind, Vaccine Equity in the Global South. We have people from all across Canada and from different parts of the globe. We have people from India joining us, and from Zambia, different parts of Africa, Europe, the United States, Latin America. So welcome to everyone. First, we actually just heard that there's a power outage on New Delhi. So I don't know if our Delhi friends are here, including our speaker is having a hard time connecting, but we're hoping that will be resolved. Some practical information. Everyone's mics will be muted and the videos will be turned off just to avoid interference. We ask everyone to write your questions in the question and answer box that it's at the bottom of your screen. And Dr. Sachs will be with us only for the first 30 minutes. So following his presentation, we will take a couple of questions for him. And otherwise, we will read your questions at the end for all the panelists. As I said, one of our panelists right now is having a problem connecting because of a power outage, but we will adapt as time goes on. The session is being recorded, and all the participants who have registered will receive a link to the recording within 24 hours. Before I introduce our panelists, even though we're all in different locations, since we're hosting it from Toronto, which is where Canadian Jesuits International is, I invite my colleague, Peter Niemeyer, who is actually responsible for most of the planning for this webinar, to acknowledge the land on which we stand. Peter.
Thank you very much, Jenny, and a warm welcome to our panelists and to all who are joining us from various parts of around the world. Land acknowledgement is a practice here in Canada in response to the recommendations of Indigenous peoples in recognition of the need to work for Indigenous justice. The need for this justice work was brought home by the discovery of the remains of 215 children buried at the Kamloops Indian Residential School in British Columbia here in Canada. Therefore, as CGI, we acknowledge the land we are meeting on is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit, also known as the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Treaty. We wanted to take a moment of silence or prayer to acknowledge, remember, and honor the lives of these 215 children. We also mourn the loss of the Absal family from London, Ontario, Canada, whose tragic deaths as a result of a hate crime against the Muslim community remind us of the need to overcome Islamophobia and hatred. Let us remember also those who are mourning or are sick and those who are dying of hunger because of COVID-19. Let's hold a minute of silence together.
Thank you, Peter. So we've organized this webinar on access to COVID vaccines because this is an economic, political, and ethical challenge of our times. We have done so because we work with partners in Africa, Asia, and Latin America who work with marginalized people, and they are struggling with a health and economic crisis of unprecedented proportions. We in Canada are beginning to see the light at the end of the tunnel, but we have in sub-Saharan Africa, for example, less than 1% have been vaccinated. And despite the headlines following the G7 meeting, in terms of response to the pandemic, some have classified the gathering as an unforgivable moral lapse. So we are here today to discuss this issue, to talk about it, to hear the voices of people from across the globe, and to spur us to action, to ensure that there is equity and justice for everyone around the globe. So we have an excellent, very qualified panel of people to speak on this issue, to whom I am extremely grateful for responding to our invitation. And just in alphabetical order, I'd like to introduce, we will introduce them more later, but is Fr Charles Chilufya, located in Zambia. Currently, he works out of Nairobi, but he's currently in Zambia. We have also Dr. Sunita Narain, who is in New Delhi, but who, as I mentioned, right now they're experiencing a power outage, but we spoke to her shortly before this webinar started. We're hoping she will join us. We have Dr. Katrina Plamondon in Kelowna, Canada, and Dr. Jeffrey Sachs, who is in New York City in the United States, to address this issue and this challenge before us. So I welcome all of you, and we would like to start immediately with our first speaker, who is Dr. Jeffrey Sachs. Dr. Sachs, welcome. Dr. Sachs is a university professor and director of the Center for Sustainable Development at Columbia University. He's also the president of the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network and a commissioner of the UN Broadband Commission for Development. He has been advisor to 3 United Nations Secretary General and currently serves as a Sustainable Development Goal advocate under Secretary General Antonio Guterres. And there are many other things we could say. I'll just add that he was ranked by The Economist among the top 3 most influential living economists. We are honored and delighted to have you with us. And we know you can only stay with us for the first part, but welcome, and to you the floor.
Thank you very much. Thank you for including me, and thank you for this very important and timely discussion. Let me try to be as succinct and helpful as I can be. We are now 1.5 years into this pandemic. And since the beginning of this year, we have coming on stream a number of vaccines that are effective in preventing illness and preventing deaths. This is, by the way, rather remarkable that within 1 year, there are about a dozen vaccines for a new disease. It raises a lot of interesting questions that I'm going to put aside for the moment, just to talk about the vaccine production, coverage, and timeline. The vaccines are made overwhelmingly in the United States, Europe, Russia, China, and India. And the rest of the world is not participating in the manufacture of these vaccines to date. In some sense, this is not surprising given the very short period from the emergence of the disease to where we are today, because with other diseases that we are familiar with, they've been with humanity for decades or even centuries. Whereas this is a new disease that is 18 months identified and vaccines are only 6 months in operation. There have been 2.4 billion doses given. That means a coverage of about 1.2 billion people, because for all of the vaccines to date, it's 2 doses per vaccine for for an effective protection. And that is roughly a fifth of the world's needs, because to have coverage of 60% of the world population would be about 4.7 billion people. And that would be roughly 80% of the adult population of the world. So we're looking for something around 5 billion fully immunized people. And we have roughly 1 billion so far fully immunized. But of those 1 billion, they are overwhelmingly in the producing countries, in the United States, Europe, China, India, and Russia. And the vaccine manufacturers have used the bulk of their own production for their own populations, and a limited amount abroad. And for poor countries, almost nothing. COVAX was created early in the pandemic to achieve coverage of vaccinations in all countries, indeed, with the focus on 92 low and lower middle income countries. COVAX so far has basically failed, however, because the supply of vaccines to this international agreement, in order to protect the population that they targeted, has been very small. So COVAX has not received an adequate or predicted flow. Indeed, COVAX did rely early on production of one of the vaccines, the AstraZeneca vaccine, in an Indian major institution. But then when India suffered a terrible wave of disease this year, the Indian government put an export ban on the vaccine. So vaccines that COVAX was expected to get did not materialize. This has left dozens and dozens of countries with almost nothing, and they're scrambling and they're begging for help. In the meantime, the companies have had the following procedure. Mostly they have sold to their host governments. The United States took what it could. The EU took what it could. In China and Russia, it's even more to that circumstance. And for what was not going to those home countries has been allocated on the basis largely of private contracts, usually secret contracts. We don't even know the terms that Pfizer has charged. But countries that have been able to get to the front of the queue, like Israel, well, they got a lot of coverage. And other countries that don't have the money or went through COVAX ended up empty-handed till now, because they didn't go directly to Pfizer or to Moderna or to the other vaccine companies. They went through the official process. So if you went through the official process, you've lost. If you tried to make a deal under the table, you've had somewhat more success. If you're a citizen of the United States, you've had access. If you are a citizen in Europe, there's been a lag of about 8 to 10 weeks behind the United States, but now vaccine coverage is scaling up. If you are in Paraguay or in Togo or in Benin, you're waiting. You don't know, and no one's telling you what is happening. They're just telling you to wait and be quiet. Now, let me state some good news, some bad news, and some other news briefly. The good news is that the rich countries are reaching a kind of saturation because they have covered their population. Sadly, not to 80% of adult protection, because we have anti-vax sentiment in the United States, for example. So even though the vaccines are fully available, people don't want them, which you say how ironic that is, with people dying in poor and vulnerable countries. But that is the reality of these days. This means that the US has a large excess production capacity now. That's extremely important. The same will be true shortly in Europe. The same will be true increasingly in China, and so forth. And so there will be more flow of vaccines available, not grabbed by the rich and powerful countries simply because you run out of arms to give immunizations to. And this is why the G7 countries last weekend said that they would provide 870 million doses during the coming 12 months. First, divide by 2. That's 435 million fully vaccinated people. So it is modest, not insignificant, but not as big as 870 million, because one is doses, the second is people. That's the good news. There is vaccine supply. The bad news is, shockingly, distressingly, there is no plan for how we're going to reach everybody right now. To my mind, it's a disgrace that we don't have a clear timeline, a clear accounting month by month of when vaccines will be available and to whom they will go. Most governments have no idea when they're going to get coverage. And COVAX is not telling them. And the G7 announces big numbers like this, but then there's no plan. And what is really distressing is there is no overarching plan. Now, I can only tell you what I am able to do in my own spreadsheets. And that is to show that based on the announcements by the companies, if those announcements are true, we could get comprehensive coverage for the whole world by early 2022 with the existing companies and now with Novavax added to the list. So we could be within 8 months of comprehensive coverage, but to do so would require a plan where poor people matter, where there is clarity about how, when, where there is the financing to underpin this. And this is what I would demand from this group. I would ask this group to demand of the US government, of the European Union, of China, India, Russia, as a start. Where are the vaccines? When are they coming to the whole world? Where is the plan? And to demand that of WHO also. It's like a homework assignment for them. I do it by myself in my spare time on a spreadsheet. And then I send it to these people and say, what's your plan? And I get no answer. It's annoying, frankly, the deliberate neglect of serious homework. I'm a professor, I like to give homework. They don't do the homework. I would fail all of these governments, frankly, because they're not doing the most basic things that they should be doing right now. I try to figure out why. What I can tell you is partly because they're not very competent, partly because our governments don't deal with the companies properly. The companies are in charge, not the governments. That's ridiculous. We funded these vaccines. We paid for these vaccines. So why isn't Pfizer called and said, what is your production line? This is how much is going. You're going to get your costs covered, and that's the end of the story. That's because we are not run by the United States government. We're run by Pfizer. Believe me, this is another problem. Another part of the problem is the US government doesn't talk to the Chinese officials because there's one sandbox and the two children don't play nicely together. And so we can't get the US technocrats talking with the Chinese technocrats to make a proper plan. And that's what's needed. We just have the G7 and NATO spending all its time criticizing China, not talking about how we're going to get the pandemic ended. So that's where I want to put the closure on this. The good news is there is vaccine supply. The bad news is there is no plan of allocation right now. There's just announcements. Now, finally, I want to talk about the waiver, the intellectual property rights and so forth. I doubt, I'm in favor of the waiver. I doubt that it will make a practical difference in the next 6 months, because actually to be able to do what is not being done right now is probably years of effort. It's worth making the waiver because maybe that view is wrong. So our goal is to maximize the speed of coverage. And anyway, it was already negotiated, and I was part of that 20 years ago. Public health takes precedence over intellectual property. But you should not think in a practical manner about the next 6 months that the IP is the real story here. The real story here is laboratories that are producing that have no plan of allocation, no transparency, and no consistency of government organization. We need the IP to be widely available as a general matter. By the way, governments paid for it. It's all the fact that it was transferred to private hands and has made several billionaires is outrageous anyway. But it's probably not what's going to get the vaccines into people's arms in October and November. Those are probably going to be Pfizer or BioNTech or Novavax or Sputnik or Sinovac or CanBio vaccines that are properly allocated. Going forward for the longer term, a clear message is we need vaccine production capacity and pharmaceutical production capacity on every continent so that we are not in the hands of a few powerful players. That's for sure. So that's an absolute lesson of this. I don't trust my own government for a moment. I don't trust their decency, their sincerity, their capacity. We can't until they prove it. And I believe that we need, therefore, the capacity in Africa, in Latin America, in Asia to produce life-saving vaccines and medications. But just I want to emphasize as a practical matter, that's not about the next 6 months. The next 6 months is about stopping this pandemic and getting these vaccines properly deployed internationally. And from everything I know, it can be done, but it needs a plan. And I think we should press on these countries. Don't make announcements about numbers. Show us the plan so that this is really being done. And don't tell us that it's going to take 2 years, because it isn't. It doesn't have to. It can be done a lot faster than that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sachs. We really appreciate this strong beginning to our webinar. There have been a couple of questions that have been written by people, but I think you have already addressed them specifically to you. One was, why are countries, do they not realize that not vaccinating poor countries affects us all? And the other one was relating to what your opinion was about lifting the patent protection for vaccines to enable more production. And I think you have addressed both of them. I don't know if you want to say anything more that, especially around the question of why aren't governments acting?
I do want to say one more bit about that. We know that the longer that this epidemic surges, there are more variants and they are dangerous, and they come back to every rich country. So the cliche that we're all in this together happens to be literally true. Your vaccine and mine depend on this ending everywhere. And this is both common sense and practical biology. I watch the process up close day to day, and I'm aghast at how disorganized it is, how incompetent it is. And truly, I can't answer the question fully of what is the problem. Because if I were empowered to do so, I'd have people around a Zoom table in an hour and we'd work out a spreadsheet and work out a plan and work out the financing, and it wouldn't take long. And yet that has not happened until now. I can guarantee it, because I'm watching closely and pressing them to do it. And in the US government, we have 6 or 8 people who are supposed to be in charge. I don't see any evidence of anyone really being in charge. And I see not empty statements. I'm glad they announced that they're giving away doses, but I think the US is often more interested in giving away doses because it's the US, and you see China, we're giving away our doses. And so they wanted to get to Taiwan immediately and so forth. That's politics. That's not public health. And that is a lot of the motivation also. This is guided by, it's guided by people who have geopolitics on their mind, not public health on their mind. And that is troubling.
Thank you. Maybe one last thing. What somebody's asking, what can we do as civil society to pressure companies and governments to ensure, to ensure the release of patents, or perhaps to make a plan?
Yeah, I think we should do. You're a powerful voice, and please address Prime Minister Trudeau, President Biden, President van der Leyen of the European Union, Prime Minister Boris Johnson. Where is your plan? Numbers, timelines, dates by company. This, to my mind, that's what that's what I recommend, which is not to beg them, but to say this is outrageous, because we know that the supplies are actually there. We can count. But okay, you put them all in your own arms first. What about the rest of the world? What's the timeline that you show us, so that we in civil society can answer? You don't do arithmetic very well, or how about this, or you haven't done the following. In other words, we're punching at a phantom right now, because they don't even show us clearly what they have in mind. And COVAX is awful in this regard, because it's still stuck with, COVAX is supposed to be the answer to this, but they haven't shown it either. So I think this should also go to WHO and say, as the center of the international system, where is your spreadsheet? And I would also encourage to the UN leadership, because, of course, I know they're frustrated, but this is, and to the companies, although I don't even want to deal with the companies. I want to deal with our governments to get this thing done. This is a public good, and I do not believe this is a market good. And I'm underwhelmed by the companies, because they didn't develop these things. They bought this intellectual property. And so, yeah, they're making billions, tens of billions of dollars of market value on it right now. But they should be absolutely told what to do right now. We're in the greatest public health emergency of a century. So where are they? I mean, where are we telling them what to do? That's what we should be doing.
Thank you, Dr. Sachs. That's a very powerful statement. There are many questions coming in, but we know that you have to go, and we also have 3 more speakers. I hope you can stay as long as you can. I know you also have to go early, so in case you're not here when we do our thank you, I just want to say a deep word of appreciation for your presence today, and also for the work that you're doing on this topic. And I'm afraid that you will hear from us again, because this is not going to be resolved soon.
I was going to say that any statements that you make, I can help to amplify, because I can get them directly to leaders, and I will be very pleased to do that, very honored to do that.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So thank you for your great presentation. Now, our next speaker was to be Dr. Sunita, who was to give us a testimony from India. And as I mentioned earlier, this is a reality that we work with and that they work with. Right now there is a power outage, even though she did connect earlier with us. So while we wait for her and hope that she and all the other colleagues and friends who were connecting from New Delhi will join us, we move on to our next speaker, and I will ask Peter to introduce him.
Thank you, Jenny. Our next speaker is going to be Father Charles Chilufya. He is the coordinator of the Africa Task Force of the Vatican COVID-19 Commission. He is a Jesuit priest from Zambia and currently is the coordinator of the JCAM, Justice and Ecology Office of the Jesuit Conference of Africa and Madagascar, and has been director of that since 2018. Father Charles also founded the Jesuit Center for Leadership and Development, which aims to equip a new generation of African business and other leaders for service marked by integrity, excellence, and a spirit of Ubuntu. Charles.
Thank you very much, Peter. Thank you, Jenny. I'm very delighted to be part of this conversation, this dialogue. And in my presentation, I'm going to focus on the fact that what we're talking about here is life. It's human beings. It's human rights. And so I'd like to begin by quoting Article 25 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, that everyone has a right to a standard of living adequate for the health and well-being of himself and of his family, including food, clothing, housing, and medical care and necessary social services, and the right to security in the event of unemployment or sickness or disability. But what about the very poor, most of them in the global south? The human rights of the poor experiencing health and social blows of COVID-19 do not merely remain unfulfilled, but as we have heard, they're not like an unavoidable severe winter. Sadly, the right to life that we're talking about today, to health and well-being, all of these rights remain unfulfilled by human choice, as we have just heard from Professor Sachs. It's human choice. We can change this in no time. I'm sad that the persistence of the current suffering and generally severe poverty depend on human decisions at all levels, from large political decisions about basic rules of our global economy, our global society, but it is not happening. This severe poverty and deprivation of rights should be classified as a human rights violation. And I would like to, as Professor Sachs, to encourage all of us from the North, that as this is happening, since most of us from the global North are in democratic societies, this is also your responsibility. This is our responsibility to move these people, to push these people to do what is right. It's life under threat. It's life that is being denied. I'd like to point to a few social problems in Africa, where I am, because this dialogue also wants to bring out the impact beyond the health impact, the impacts of COVID-19, to show how COVID is not only a health threat, but also a threat to several other spheres of life, the social life, economic life. Let me just show a few things. So as I've mentioned, and as Professor Sachs has mentioned, the problem here is that this health crisis, which is a global justice crisis, is a failure of humanity. Rich countries are vaccinating one person every second, while many countries here in Africa haven't even vaccinated one. Sadly, the truth is that the world can change this. It can produce vaccines if it wants. There are factories lying idle all over the world in the midst of this pandemic. But because world leaders are putting the pharmaceuticals industry interests first, it is not happening. Not only interest, profits. As we heard from Dr. Tedros, inequality has now become more grotesque every day. I'm just showing you some of the very real things that are happening. Job losses, yeah, which mean reduced spending, which means no more businesses, which mean very limited now or diminished, dwindled economic activity. And this is going to continue to happen if this is not stopped. And here in Africa, recovery is impossible. Elsewhere, they're talking about post-COVID, and they're talking about building back. We can't talk about that. Recovery here will be prolonged as long as this thing stays. And this is added to the fact that even before COVID, the situation for many people here was very dire. There were vulnerabilities that we were yet to deal with, which have been exacerbated by this problem, including weak adaptive capacity for households which don't have savings. When there is a lockdown and these households can't earn, they have no savings to go to and draw income or money to respond to the crisis. And then, of course, on the overall macroeconomic impacts of depressed economic activity. And here, because of the current problem, our earnings in tourism aren't the same. Our earnings in other commodities aren't the same. With increasing debt, and our governments are broke. And this has consequences for life, because our governments then can't spend on health. They can't spend on education. They can't spend on anything that supports life. So there are human costs to this. And you may have seen that FAO has said for 12 consecutive months, there has been a spike in food prices, estimated at 39.7 over the last 1 year, 40% increase. What does this mean? Before I go to that, I want to show also that the future of these little ones, of the youth, is also under threat, because education has been interrupted for many children for the last 1 year. Some schools haven't yet even reopened. It's not only the future of these children that is at stake, but also the future of the nation. You may have heard also that there have been efforts in the last 30 years to enhance enrollment in Africa and in the global South. But estimates are saying that all of this is being reversed. And I just don't want to quote statistics for you. I put there a quote from a mother, crying, "My child is no longer learning. She is only waiting for the reopening to continue with her studies." So there are people crying, there are people in distress, worried, yeah, people losing jobs. And like I said, all of this simply means that poverty is deepening. I'm showing you that according to World Bank, we have new 39 million people who are poor, whose poverty has worsened. These are people who live below $1 a day. Yeah. And like I said, for Africa, this is exacerbated. You can see globally, they talk about a reduction in poverty. And that's what I'm showing in my slide there. You could see in 1990, there was a higher number of poor people in East Asia, and it is lower. But for Africa, that number didn't reduce. It actually increased from 279 to 412 5 years ago. And as at last year, it was 477 million. Add to that 29 million people, it's over 500 million people who are poor, who are living below $1 a day in Africa. Poverty has been deepened, and there's increased exclusion. Put simply, there's no food in the fridge, as you can see. There's no food at table for many. And this is not a story, this is reality. This is something we're saying. Like I said, these are lives at stake. I'm going to give you two very harrowing stories. You see this unfinished house and some young lady, with her permission, I took that picture. So it's not something I took off the internet. I took that picture because we were alerted to many young people and families that were evicted because they couldn't pay. And this young girl went to that unfinished house to live there with her child, 2 children. And there she was attacked. She was sexually violated and 2 people took her. But before that, she was sleeping on a rooftop that you can see on the right-hand side picture with a covering there. Those are human beings are suffering because of the serious effects of COVID. Like I said, I don't want to just give you statistics. These are real people that I'm showing you. These are people we have met. And I give you that account of that beautiful young lady, a flower vendor. But when we had locked down for several months, look what she says. She says, I live 40 kilometers outside Nairobi. In Nairobi, where I do business, reselling flowers. This business is my lifeline. But with the imposition of the lockdown on Nairobi, I cannot take a bus into Nairobi. But that means no business and no daily income. So my savings are almost zero. So to make ends meet, what I do is I walk through the bush paths for 80 kilometers of a return journey every day to find my way into the city away from the police. This is, I mean, why does somebody have to do nothing? This is unfair. Is it reasonable that the safety of everyone is at stake because of the profits of a few people? Is it fair that over 100 countries are calling for a TRIPS waiver when under 6 countries or 2 are saying no, and all these lives that are showing you are at stake? Is this fair? That all of this is simply about the profits and money of a few. I'd like to begin concluding by pointing to all of us globally that we are capable of making change because we are people who can be driven by compassion and care. As we see that very powerful quote, the nature of humanity, its essence is to feel another's pain as one's own and to act to take that pain away. There is nobility in compassion, a beauty in empathy, a grace in forgiveness. The other thing that we could do with these, our governments, is to call them to what is human, what anybody is capable of, and what makes us human, to care and to be compassionate. We need global justice. We need to change the rules. Look at what we heard from a leader, a global leader saying the vaccine was produced out of greed. This is a global leader. This is embarrassing. I'm happy that one other MP retweeted and said, altruism, not greed, will get us out of this. We need to restrain greed, not to celebrate it. How can a leader celebrate greed? Embarrassing. We need global rules that are founded on compassion, on justice, to change things for us. And I offer you a philosophy we call Ubuntu from Africa, that I am through others. I am because we are. And this is how the world should be governed. This is how the world should be managed, with philosophies like that, with thinking like that. A concept of social solidarity that ensures the well-being of every person. This is what will bring social stability, as we have heard. And we've heard this repeated phrase, we can't be okay unless every one of us is okay. And this is what the world needs, a logic of coexistence, working towards peaceful coexistence on the basis of justice, fairness, and equity. And to achieve this, yes, TRIPS is a beginning point, but it is not enough. The point is we have capacity to do this. We can change this. We need a global polity undergirded by these values from a perspective of interconnectedness, as Pope Francis reminds us, that everything is interconnected. We are also interconnected. And I would like to end by highlighting some of the things that the social doctrine of the church, or anything, any good teaching helps us to live as human beings. That we together, if we are compassionate people, and we have responsibility, as we have heard, both all of us here in the South and those in the North, who have had chance to change the rules. The North has a chance to make the rules that govern humanity. The last 30 years since the falling down of the Iron Curtain. But the rules that have been made at the expense of most of humanity, in trade, in economics, anything. But the point is, we can change this. Humanity can change this. And as Pope Francis calls us, we can be that good Samaritan that feels the pain of the other and do something. And Pope Francis also reminds us that we can change this. We can prepare a future we want. Imagine a future that is life-giving, an economy that is life-giving, a future that promotes life rather than kill it. We have power to change, and we can do that. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Father Charles Chilufya. I appreciate your presentation. I can see my Zoom is telling me that you can't hear me. I hope you can hear. So thank you very much. We are happy that now we are Dr. Sunita is actually been able to join us. We're delighted about that. Thank you for joining us. We were concerned. Dr. Sunita Narain is an environmentalist and a writer, and is the director of the Delhi-based Center for Science and Environment. And she is the editor. Dr. Narain plays an active role in policy formulation on issues of environment and development in India and globally. She has co-authored influential publications on India's environment, conducted in-depth research on the governance and management of the country's environment. And among her many, many qualifications and honors that she has received, in 2016, she was featured in Time magazine World. We are deeply honored to have you.
So what Jenny was saying there is that Dr. Sunita was featured in Time magazine as one of the 100 most influential people in the world. So welcome here, Dr. Sunita. We look forward to your presentation.
Thank you, Peter, and thank you, Jenny. And again, apologies. As you may have explained, the power went off quite suddenly in Delhi, and it's just come back. So I'm glad that I caught Father Chilufya's presentation at the end. It was really powerful. Thank you, Father Chilufya. And I just want to add my words to this and say how severely we have all been impacted. I live in Delhi. This last few months in Delhi, we have really seen what can only be called an apocalypse. We have had massive tragedy, and tragedy that has come home to everybody. I mean, you know, when we talked about the virus, we talked about it last year as if something that was happening to someone else. But this time it has come home to every house. And what we need to understand, and what is very clear also, is that it is the poor who are bearing the brunt of the contagion. Let's be very clear, it is they who have suffered the most because of the infection. They are the most vulnerable. Today in India, we have seen that the virus has actually gone into rural areas where there is poor health care. where people do not have access to what we believe, what we know today is one of the biggest protectors, which is clean water to wash your hands. The ability to be able to protect yourself just doesn't exist. And as a result of it, it is very large numbers of people, and particularly the poor in our world, who are worst impacted. But it's also about not just the impact because of the contagion and the disease and the death and the fact that you lose your loved ones, but it is also the fact that you lose your livelihood. So there is a double whammy as far as the poor are concerned. In our part of the world, whether it is India, whether it is Africa, governments don't have the wherewithal to provide that extensive social security that is required to make sure that the poor get and that everybody gets a certain amount of economic assistance so that they can survive this. And this has been now for over a year. So it is, today it is very clear we are going to see all the development dividend that was worked on. For years, the investment that was made to improve the conditions of people, we will see that wiped out in this period. One, because of the fact that people will invest whatever money they have in the health to protect their loved ones, and two, because of the fact that this has meant a loss of livelihood. And we are seeing that. I mean, in India, we are seeing that with massive numbers of people who have gone back home to their villages, where city economies have collapsed, where there has been reverse migration back into the villages because people have no ability to get employment now in the cities. And this is coming at a time, and I want to remind everybody that this is coming at a time also of what is clearly multiple crises. We also have to remember that the COVID-19 is not the only thing that is breaking the backs of the very poor in our world. It comes on top of the fact that we have already a huge agrarian distress situation, where we have really created such enormous problems for the world's people who work in agriculture, for the subsistence farmers who work to make sure that they can put food on the table of their families and to sell their surplus into the cities. That rural economy today is at a crisis point. And with climate change, we are seeing adverse weather events, we are seeing extreme rain events, which is adding to that human distress. In my world, we have seen 2 cyclones hit one western part of India and then eastern part of India. We know that we have seen last year, both in the Horn of Africa, in Pakistan, in India, locust attacks. All these are linked with the fact that we are getting these extreme variations in rainfall. So this, the COVID literally has come to a point where it is going to push people back into poverty, back into destitution. And the only way we can see ourselves being able to pick up and move ahead in our world is to make sure that we can provide vaccination to very large numbers of people and very quickly. And this is where the world is just not coming together. We understand today that we live in an interdependent world. We understand today that the virus has made sure that there are no boundaries. We also understand today that the poor, that unless everyone in the world is protected, nobody is protected. All that is today being talked about even by people, by the leaders of the free world who meet at G7. They talk about interdependence. They talk about the fact that they need to provide vaccines for all so that everybody can be protected. And yet the actions that we see are so little, so late. I mean, it is very clear today that the vaccine program is adding to the disparities in the world. It is designed to do so, because if you look at it, you have a few companies who are producing these vaccines. If you look at the range of prices that are being charged, the irony of it is that a vaccine is even cheaper in Europe than it is in South Africa. That the price of the vaccine today, if any country wants to be able to do universal vaccination, there is no way that they can end up with buying the vaccine and being able to provide it to their people. The price ranges from $10 to $20 to as much as $60. And all companies are doing this. It's not even one versus the other. I mean, the two Chinese companies are selling vaccines at differing rates between the two countries of our subcontinent. Bangladesh is getting it for $10 a dose, Sri Lanka for $15 a dose. Large parts of Africa are getting it for $10 a dose. I mean, which country in our part of the world can afford to buy those vaccines at that rate and supply it? Now, this is where the conversation that we are hearing in the world just doesn't seem to add up. The opposition to TRIPS and the fact that there is now this movement to say that we should waive off TRIPS provisions for a few years so that there can be more supply of the vaccines. But it's not just supply, it's a question of price. If you waive off the TRIPS, if you give a TRIPS waiver, you create a condition in which more companies can manufacture it. It becomes a generic product that brings down the price. That's the hope that we have. Of course, it will also require some amount of regulation so that it does not mean that there is again profiteering from this system. But the fact is, right now, you have a condition in which countries are saying, no, we are going to be able to donate the vaccine. So we will buy them at cost and donate them to the COVAX system of WHO. But it's not happening. The 1 billion vaccines that has been promised at the G7 is just too little, too late. We are not going to see those vaccines till 2022, and it doesn't even begin to meet the needs of the vast numbers of people in the world. If you look at India's experience, it's an interesting experience to learn from. So the Indian government initially said that it would do universal vaccination. It then rolled that back to say no, because the cost of the vaccine to the company is higher. We will create a condition in which some part of it will be universal and free vaccination, that we will do the priority groups, but the rest of it will have to be done at cost. It did not work. It cannot work. We have too many people who are too poor, and we need a universal vaccination system. The Supreme Court of India stepped in. The government also understood. We have got a policy reversal in the last 15 days. This is very welcome. We now have the government of India saying that they will do universal and free vaccination for every Indian. But the only reason we can even begin to think about this is because we do have two companies based in India, and the government of India is able to procure vaccines at $2 per dose. Now, this does mean that for a country like India, it will create economic distress. There is no doubt. But still, I believe the government of India can afford that. And we can do an effective, universal vaccination program. But that cannot be done unless you bring down the rate of vaccine per dose. So in this current situation where the rate is high and you've created a system in which countries say they will buy it and donate it, it is certainly not going to work. Even the richest countries have not come up with any plan to say that we need, WHO says we need 11 billion vaccine doses by the end of this year, if we are talking about vaccinating all. And let's also be very clear, manufacturing is not a problem. There are, according to WHO, by the end of this year, we will have 14 billion vaccine doses available. So it's the same problem, if I may say. It's the unfortunate part of our world. It's the same thing. We have so much food and so many hungry people. It's going to be the same problem. We'll have the vaccines, but we will not be able to provide it. There will be lack of access. There will be gross inequity in the supply, and there will be large numbers of people who will remain vulnerable to the disease. But like climate change, and I think this is where we need to make our world and all of us understand the fact that this time the virus is telling us there is no option. We are interdependent. We will have to cooperate. We will have to find a way to be able to work together. There is a race between the virus, the variant, and the vaccination. So no country in the world, nobody, unless you're an island nation, and I understand Australia believes that it'll be able to secure itself by making sure nobody comes in and nobody leaves. I mean, unless you can do something like that, there is no way that you will remain safe. So I think this is an opportunity for us to renegotiate not just the business of vaccines, but also renegotiate that contract that people must have, that all people in the world must have with our governments, with the global governance system that we require, with the leadership we require. I mean, for too long, we have dismembered the state. We have created a system in which the market and the state have become infused. They have become one. And for too long, we have believed that the consuming class, the people who consume, who are part of the market, are actually part of a democratic system. They are not. We have only created them as consumers. They are the market. And it is the state, the market, and the consuming classes that have become one. And that is the crisis of today's crisis of COVID, crisis of climate change. And it is time we understood that we will not be able to deal with this unless we come together as one humanity. This is a make or break moment for the world. And I do believe that we as people have to speak out so that we can make our leaders understand that we want this, because there is no way we can, any one of us can be safe, any one of us can move ahead if we leave people behind. This time it will not work. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Narain. Much, much appreciated. Very powerful points for us to remember and to take to heart. We're going to conclude our panelists' presentations with Dr. Katrina Plamondon. Dr. Katrina is an assistant professor at the School of Nursing at the University of British Columbia, Okanagan campus, whose research engages people across sectors, disciplines, organizations, and communities to create collective pathways to more equitable futures. She co-chairs the Canadian Coalition for Global Health Research's University Advisory Council and is a member of Canada's National Scientific Advisory Committee for Global Health. Welcome here, Dr. Katrina Plamondon.
Thank you. I'm so glad to be joining you today. I like slides, so I'm going to share my screen and share my slides so that I stay on track and keep focused as I chat today. Thank you so much for having me. I'm going to just start by telling you a little bit about who I am and where I come from. And so thank you for that introduction. I'm joining you this morning very close to this beautiful Okanagan Lake, which I've got a picture up. This is one of my morning meditations, is walking by this lake. It's close to where I was born, and it is where I've spent much of my adult life, is in this interior part of British Columbia, which is the unceded and traditional territory of the Syilx people. Unceded means that it is land that was never surrendered, land that is not covered by a treaty with the government of Canada or the Crown. I'm also showing you pictures of my beautiful children, and want to also acknowledge that I have heartstrings deeply tied to Treaty 4 area in Saskatchewan, where my grandmother was born on Fishing Lake First Nation and was a Cree woman. And I share this with you because I really believe strongly that who we are and where we come from matters in terms of understanding why we do what we do and understanding what steps we'll take next. And we've had 3 really inspiring presentations, each of which invited us to think about understanding why we are facing the situation we are with vaccine equity and what it's doing in the world right now, understanding what we can do. So as I talk today, I'll invite you to think about stories. I'm going to share with you some stories, and I'm going to invite you to engage. I have a little bit of an interactive thing I'll invite you into doing. And I just really love you to think about the stories we tell ourselves as Canadians, in particular, the stories that we tell ourselves about who we are in the world and what we're doing, and then invite you to think about what you are going to do as you reconcile and think through these stories. So I'll also preface, I am a knowledge translation scientist. That means that I study the processes and things that help people to put what we know to be good into action. And what we know to be good comes from both evidence, scientific evidence, and many other ways of knowing, including our values and beliefs. How do we align our intentions with what we do? And I do this all with a desire to advance equity. So when I talk about health equity, I'm talking about an aspirational ideal. It's a place of moving toward a world where, regardless of social, economic, or environmental conditions, all people have the access to live with dignity and a life trajectory that allows them the opportunity to live to their potential. Right now, that is not the kind of world that we are walking through. Right now, what we see is a world that is marked mostly by systemic differences in health and health outcomes, and very different life trajectories depending on where you're born or what your social location is within your country. So right now, we live in a world where unearned, unfair, and human-caused disadvantage shapes what you have access to, makes your path look very different depending on what you look like or where you were born. And I just can't emphasize enough how much I agree with my fellow panelists about the reality that these conditions that make such different life trajectories for different people are human caused. We made them up and we can do something about them. So as I'm talking today, I'll invite you to think about what we do and what we can do to change this narrative that we are walking through. So I'm going to invite you to take out a piece of pen and a piece of paper, because I'd like to just get ready to invite you to think through a couple of images that I'll share soon. But if you can grab a piece of paper and a pen, I'll invite you to engage a little bit with this. And as you do that, I'm going to talk just a little bit briefly about who is Canada on a global stage. So Canada is recognized as a middle power. So we are not a country with the largest economy. We are not a superpower, but we have a seat at influential tables, influential governance tables. And as a middle power, Canada has a role to play in bringing voice and pointing to issues that we care about, that we want to have elevated and amplified on a global stage. And Canadians tend to like the image that we project on a global stage. We tend to like to imagine ourselves as very polite, as friendly. We're so polite. I love this image of the Canada geese here, that even our geese are so polite that we follow the rules. We like to have a voice, but we don't like to be too loud or too disruptive with it. So if we show up to protest, now this is not the case for all Canadians, but we might have such a polite sign that we say, I'm a little upset. Canadians also love to see ourselves and still hang our hats on an image of Canadians as peacekeepers on the global stage and as a country that advocates for human rights. We're also a country, as Peter pointed out in the beginning of this session, and I get a bit emotional talking about this, because we are a country that is reconciling our own denial of genocide. So while we wag fingers at others on a global stage, we are uncovering the souls, the beautiful lives of children that have been buried beside residential schools. We are still grappling with what to do about missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. And while that is happening, we have reports in the news from, as I've circled here on this slide, not so long ago, 2008, denying and calling bogus what Indigenous community has known for a long, long time. And Indigenous community is coming together across this country now, standing in solidarity and healing together. And they've invited Canadians to think through, stand with them, and honor their shared humanity, to think about what this history means for what we're going to do next. I'm going to tell you a story about Canada and the world that I want you to keep this in mind as we talk, or as I talk, because this story is not separate from the story of Canada on a global stage. So here's the part where I would love you to take a piece of paper out and a pen. And I'm going to show you a bunch of visualizations because I love data visualizations. And I'm going to just invite you to make some notes. I would like you to make a line down the middle of your page and just make some observational notes. I'm going to go through some images fairly quickly. And I would just love for you to notice what countries are bearing a greater burden and what countries are bearing a lesser burden. So I'm going to start by showing you, these are cartographs created by a guy named Benjamin Henning, who has his data visualizations on worldmapper.org. I love these. So what he does is takes massive data sets and imposes them on different kinds of maps. And what he's effectively done here is he's ballooned those countries that have a proportionately greater burden of something, and he's collapsed the borders of countries that bear a lesser burden of something. So in this case, I'm showing you a slide of, it's a multidimensional index of poverty, of absolute poverty and deprivation in health. So I just invite you to notice which countries, what parts of the world are ballooned and what parts are collapsed. I'll give you a second or two there. I'm going to show you a few of these and we'll go through them a little bit quickly. Here is another standard indicator that is used, that's fairly reliable data internationally when we make comparisons between countries. So this again is countries with a greater burden are ballooned and those with a lesser burden are collapsed. So this is under age 5 mortality. So deaths in children. What parts of the world are ballooned? What parts are collapsed? Where is the burden? Where is most of the under age 5 mortality occurring? Here is COVID mortality. So this is data from January 2021. So this does not include what's happened in India with the wave of the Delta variant that has just been, as we heard earlier, absolutely devastatingly catastrophic and apocalyptic, we heard earlier. So where are COVID deaths occurring? This is not reflective of caseload. It is reflective of where are people dying from COVID. So keeping up with the story in your paper and your map, I'm now showing you what Professor Sachs referred to earlier were these pre-purchase agreements. So which countries engaged in making arrangements with pharmaceutical companies and to what degree? And you'll see in this map, my own country, Canada, has secured enough through our pre-purchase agreements to vaccinate Canadians, each Canadian, at least 10 times. These were in agreements before vaccine was available. They were secret, they remain secret. These are our pre-purchase agreements. What parts of the world, just put a check mark under what parts of the world had the capacity and access to make pre-purchase agreements for vaccine. Similarly, again, this is now away from Benjamin Henning. This is from our World in Data. Here's just from yesterday, an updated visual of where are vaccines being distributed. So again, as you can see in Canada, where I'm very privileged to be standing on this unceded and traditional territory of the Syilx people, and in a province where we have more than 75% of our population vaccinated. We are seeing second doses of vaccine being rolled out rapidly, and movie theaters are opening today. People can gather outside today, and people are celebrating being able to come together today in this country. Who has access, who does not? You can put a little check mark on your piece of paper if you're still participating in this little bit of homework. And this is a bit outdated as well. I couldn't find a more updated one. There are some debates about when the world will have access and ability to distribute vaccine. And some calculations I've heard that it will take, at this rate, at what we're currently doing, it could take as many as 57 years to reach most of the continent of Africa with vaccine, if what we continue to do remains what we do. And I would argue that although it's saying that the US and wouldn't be till late 2021, we've actually seen that might happen much sooner. Same with Canada. This might happen much sooner than what we anticipated, because we have been able to have so much vaccine come into our country because of our pre-purchase agreements. Here's another visual. Again, I just invite you to make a check on your paper. Which countries are opposing and supporting the waiver of the trade agreement that we've heard about today, which is a waiver of intellectual property, that when it was originally proposed more than 6 months ago, would have made a difference in rapid scale up of manufacturing, but because of prolonged stalling, including stalling from our own Canadian government, by virtue of inaction and asking many, many questions and demanding more information, even though the argument was already fairly clear and well established, the countries that are opposing versus the countries that were supporting, the yellow stars are supporting. You'll see that the United States has now come in favor of the TRIPS waiver. There has been progress in the European Union, and I understand that there's possible that Canada may finally get out of the way for this. So I hope when we look at that image of where you've made some marks on those visualizations, you'll see that there is a persistent pattern, and it doesn't matter what health indicator we look at. It doesn't matter whether we're looking at life expectancy or whether we're looking at HIV prevalence or COVID mortality. The pattern is the same, and it is repeated again and again, and it is a pattern that mirrors the history and legacy of colonization. This history and legacy that has created a political economy that we are currently living with, and I will come back to in just a moment. So here is what Canada has done from leadership from public health and NGO networks, some of which I'm part of, and I just want to highlight Canadians making a difference using their social media platforms, using their spheres of influence to draw attention to issues of equity and what we would like our government to do. Here are some of the statements that have been made, all of which you can find by visiting the CCGHR, www.ccghr.ca. You can find these statements. Canada has contributed to COVAX and likes to consider ourselves, and I'm happy Canada has done this. We are an anchor contributor to COVAX. We've contributed 440 million toward the procurement of vaccines for low and middle income countries. But we've also, as I said already, pre-purchased enough vaccine to vaccinate Canadians 10 times over. We have a no sharing policy until all Canadians have access to vaccine. We have come in the way of the TRIPS waiver, and we're contributing to stalling manufacturing capacity even within our own country. And I think this was referred to earlier. So as Canadians are celebrating their good deeds on a global stage, giving ourselves badges of ribbons for how great we are to be contributing to equity, we're doing it rather late. We're doing it in a way that actually is relying on an intense amount of dehumanization and that ignores the failures of global governance, where our international financial institutions are at complete odds with our global health institutions. And we've decided that there's just nothing to be done, when actually there's so much that could be done to resolve the failure, the catastrophic failure to humanity in not working together and not seeing our lives as intimately tied up in each other. So I'm conscious of time. I would say a bit more about governments, but I want to focus on what we can do, because I firmly believe that the same actions that led to 215 souls buried behind or beside a residential school are the same kinds of dehumanizing and gross indignities that are used to rationalize irrational things. We make the lives of not rich, not white people less important than others. And we use this in irrational ways to justify policy and action that elevates the already privileged and ignores the consequences for the rest of the world, even within our own country. So what can we do? We can act globally. We can recognize our inherent interconnectedness, the dependence and reliance that my life is tied up in the lives of every other person. And what we do in this moment of crisis, where COVID has given us a lens to see the world through and to realize that our future humanity, our future as humanity on this planet is tied up in each other. So we can consider our action for global health as a global public good and an investment in our shared futures. Our country, our government can get out of the way at the World Trade Organization. It can be a more genuine voice for equity. It can elevate equity and our global public good over profit and make strings attached, require of the pharmaceutical companies to behave in different ways. Get over the impediments and the lack of governance mechanism right now to reconcile the problems and the clashes between our international financial institutions and our international health organizations. We can solve this problem because humans created all of those structures and humans can change them. Most importantly, can you not hear me? Most importantly, what I would like to invite you to do is to use your voice. Each of you who is joining today has a sphere of influence. You can all do something. All of you can do something. Use it. Call your MP, talk to your communities, help people to understand how important our global action is and demand better. Yes, and live as a human, recognize our shared humanity. Stop dehumanizing, stop using dehumanizing justifications for irrational things. That's where I'll end it. And I'm sorry, I realize I'm not sure if people couldn't hear me at the end, but I'll stop sharing.
Oops. Yes, we did. We could hear you. At least I could.
Okay,
I think most of us did. Thank you very, very much. That was a brilliant way to conclude the circle of very powerful presentations. We have many questions, many comments, which we have gathered together, and obviously I will not be able to. We will not be able to address them all, but. We have a few minutes to answer a few. I will perhaps put them together in under topics. So there's a series of questions around governance. and international global governance. So the questions are relating to, do we lack a worldwide governance body or planning or coordinator? Why is the WHO, a World Health Organization, not leading the way? What role do they play? And in what capacity of enforcement they have, I would add, in these questions. I don't know if one of you would like to address that question, or maybe even more than one of you.
I can,
Dr. Sunita?
Jenny, I can take the question. I mean, I think we are all aware of just how weak global governance has become. And, you know, over the past some years, there have been very powerful leaders that we've had in our world who have really hammered away at the world's ability to be able to think together and act together, and actually even denigrated and undermined any global action. As a climate change activist, I can tell you, Jenny, that this is not new, that we have over the last 30 years, something as big as climate change. I mean, it is a catastrophe awaiting us. It is an existential issue. And yet, even when it comes to climate change, we have seen very little global action. And there, of course, there have been the private interests of the fossil fuel industry combined with the lack of ability to think cooperatively, to think that equity is a prerequisite for an agreement. And that's what we are seeing back again. On WHO, very quickly, I just want to say that I think we have really disabled our institutions. And I come from a part of the world where I know we, that it takes so much effort to build an institution and so little effort to actually destroy it. And with WHO, the whole crisis began last year. I mean, all of us can and must ask, what was WHO doing? Why did it not call out what was happening in China? And of course, subsequently, WHO has tried, but you know, the COVAX facility, it doesn't have the space to be able to be a global leader and have a strong voice. And I think that's where our biggest problem is.
Thank you. Thank you. Unless one of the other panelists wanted to say something about that point, I'll pass on to another question. So there are a couple of questions around the infrastructure or capacity in the global south. So some people are saying, some of the questions relate to, if given the level of infrastructure or the health system, the way the status of the health system in many countries in the global south, is there a capacity to roll out, even if they were available, both vaccines and also treatments? Is there a capacity to roll them out and to implement a vaccination campaign and treatment campaign at the local level? Would somebody like to address that question? Maybe Charles, or to speak maybe a bit about the reality in Africa?
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, that's a statement that has been used, and in some cases is just used, you know, to dismiss the cause for the waiver. Two responses. Number one, yeah, there are problems with capacity which can be built because of this emergency. We can't just resign and say there's no capacity. But at the same time, I would like to mention that there are 5 or 6 countries in Africa that make vaccines, and Johnson & Johnson entered into an agreement with South Africa to make vaccines from South Africa. And you will also know that when it comes to other goods and products that big corporations make, they have global networks, which include the South. If they can globalize business at that level, if there's good governance and decisions and choice, we can globalize the production of vaccines in that regard. Yeah, so that question of capacity really, for me, doesn't hold much water. There are countries that make, but capacity can also be built, and also businesses with other products build global networks of production. And I believe that can also be done with the vaccine.
Mm. Can I add
Thank
briefly?
you. Yes, sure.
Yeah, just I would add briefly that I think there is a very problematic and paternalistic attitude from the global north that says somehow that that the expertise, know-how, and manufacturing can only be done by the amazingly skilled, self-reinforcing knowledge of the North. This is a lie that is told again and again, and is used to justify entrenching systems of power. Actually, it's used in ways that. So this is an example of an irrational, dehumanizing justification for actions that actually are harmful and entrench a distribution of power, wealth, and resources that serves the interests of the North. It serves the interests of companies situated in the rich countries that want to keep it there. So I just think we need to challenge and push back on our governments when they suggest that somehow their know-how, knowledge, or manufacturing is what the world needs. They do need to contribute, but they also need to get out of the way and actually leverage what's available around the world and look at this as a global collective effort, and not something that the North uses to continually reinforce a very colonial ideal that they instead put a sticker of like, do good humanitarian work on our lapel, as though we've done something good.
Thank you. I'm going to suggest something. We did say this webinar would end at 1 o'clock Toronto time, and it is 1 o'clock Toronto time. I'm going to invite, if it's okay with the panelists, maybe to answer another question. So maybe we can stay another 5 minutes, if it's okay with you. But for people who need to go, and I know already some people have sent very complimentary and appreciative comments to all of you for the presentations, and I know that there are people who need to go back to work or other commitments. So we are grateful for the many people who registered for this webinar, and from all over the world, really, and also grateful for the questions that have been asked. We do hope to. We look forward to all of you will receive a copy, a recording of this webinar within 24 hours. So for those of you who want to listen to it again or share it with other friends, please do so, because as has been remarked by all our speakers, we need to act. We are agents of change. We are global citizens. And unless we then take what we have learned today and take it forward, change will not happen. So let's use our voice. Let's listen again to what we heard and organize together to ensure that there is equity around both the vaccines, but also so that we create a more equitable world. So I invite people to stay in touch with us, to check our website, to check the websites of the organizations that are here represented by the panelists who do amazing work, and also to write to us if you have any further questions. So having said that, I'm just going to ask a couple of other questions, because there are many questions and they're all very important, and we could be here another hour, but there's a few questions around that I'm going to put together. A few are relating to agency and the participation of people in the margins in finding a solution to this crisis of COVID, which is more than a crisis of COVID. And so some people were asking, where are the voices of the youth, of marginalized people in developing the plans for response to COVID? And I'm going to put with that question, also a few comments that have been made around the crisis of democracy. Because I think obviously the two things are related, you know, that the pandemic somehow has aggravated the crisis of democracy. And so what can we do to strengthen our democracy? And I think the two things about the voice of the marginalized people and democracy are related. So I don't know who wants to address that question among, I think you're all well qualified and you've all said a lot about it. So, but if you want to say something additional about that particular question, I would appreciate it. Don't know who wants to start, maybe Dr. Sunita?
I mean, I think we've all really, I think what is very interesting in the conversation we've had this evening is that we all understand that it's not about COVID, it's not about vaccines, it's about politics, and it's about democracy that works, whether it's the global level, the national level, or the local level. And, you know, the sad thing, Jenny, has been over this last year that the virus has actually ended up with strengthening the more autocratic, undemocratic governments of our world, across the world. I think the good thing is that the virus is actually very smart. And it's also told us that these very masculine leaders of the world who believed that they could deal with the virus and sort of stomp it out. The virus has shown that, you know, their way of doing things has limits. And I think that to some extent, we are seeing today that the autocratic leaders of the world and across the world have actually been the biggest failures when it's come to dealing with the virus. But that does not mean that the crisis is over. We do have, and I think there are a lot of issues here, Jenny. There's a lot of issues with the way we have organized social media, with the way we have dismembered our institutions. It's not about, there's no switch we can turn on and off now. You can't just talk about, you know, tomorrow we'll strengthen democracy. We need to really believe in the institutions that we have and start enabling them to have a voice, whether it is the media, the judiciary, the civil society, most importantly, the local community. The people with no voice have to have a voice. But for them to have a voice, there are many other ways of being able to amplify it and give them that space. So I think there is a fight back. I think I'm not going to tell you I'm totally despondent. I think there is a fight back, and I definitely think that the very idea of saving democracy as a way to save humanity is today on the table. And I think that itself is a way ahead, because for too long we have brushed aside, we've taken for granted the idea that democracy will survive.
Thank you, Sunita, very much. And this, I'm going to let Dr. Plamondon also say a few words about this, and then I have a last question that I will ask Father Charlie to address. But this point relates very much to a comment someone has just added to our chat, which is, you know, can CGI organize an action or that we can initiate to write to our local governments? And there are people, there are groups and institutions in Canada that are active in this issue. CGI participates in some of these meetings with a lot of much more capable organizations, but we're there supporting them. And I know Dr. Plamondon can say something about that. And I would encourage people to stay in touch with us or check our website so that we can connect them, because it's important to work together with our colleagues in other NGOs and social movements. And a lot of the unions, labor unions in Canada, have also been active on this topic. And I'll let Katrina say a few words about that.
Yeah, I would just say, I do think that there can be there is a great distance in our democracy between the most citizens and their elected officials, but we can make that much smaller and we can engage with them. And if we don't tell them what we care about, then they don't know. So the louder you make your voice as a citizen in your area with your elected official, the more they can do something about that. So that's one thing that every individual citizen can do, and that I do with my own MP. And she answers me. So that's one thing. And then the other is to connect with organizations who are doing this work. So in Canada, there are many. So Médecins Sans Frontières, Doctors Without Borders is doing quite a lot. I think the People's Health Movement does amazing work, organizing work, and is speaking loudly and has an influential voice, and you can join them. The networks that I am active in leadership in are the Canadian Coalition for Global Health Research, which together with the Canadian Society for International Health are consistently engaging in bringing a voice about equity and evidence-informed action to our government. And people like me have a seat at our National Scientific Advisory Committee table where we can also bring these topics to our government to talk about and to provide that information. So reach out to the people who can amplify with you, alongside you, and use your own voice and figure out what your own sphere is. Make the connections where they're helpful. Don't be afraid to reach out to your MP or write a letter to the editor of your newspaper. Do anything you can to just actually use your voice. And then there are networks. Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives is another one. There are many that are doing good things. And it only takes a quick Google search to find a lot of this.
So I promise that everybody who participated in this webinar, when we send the recording, we will also be sending some links and also a model letter for ideas of how you can reach your MP. So we will be following up and give people some ideas of how it's possible to follow up. So thank you so much. Thank you so much, Katrina, for making that point and for encouraging us to follow up after this. This was the idea of the webinar, that we would engage more people. I just want to, one last comment. I will ask Father Charlie to address. We could all address it, but we want to close with this. And there were several questions around, or comments around, that this is an ethical crisis and an ethical question, and it's something that we need to address from that perspective as well. And I want to read in particular one question or comment that was made, which I think summarizes some of the others. And the participant, Robert, whom we know, said the Good Samaritan story has one individual helping another whom the Samaritan does not know, except that the other person belongs to an enemy group. Nevertheless, in the story, goodness overcomes everything else. But then he adds, that is an aspiration, not an instinct. And he says, I'm not surprised that groups, including nations and their political leaders, unhesitantly opt for my group first, then others. So his suggestion is that we should plan on redundant production capacity, not on contra-instinctual goodness. And he would like us to comment on that. So I'm going to ask Fr Charles Chilufya to end our webinar with a reflection on that.
Yeah, very good question. And like I said in my presentation, it points to who we are as human persons. We can choose as human beings to grow or to incentivize greed and benefits, but we can also grow ourselves to be altruistic. And that can also be reflected in the way we make our global rules and global laws. For example, what we're talking about, TRIPS incentivizes the promise for huge profits. It incentivizes greed. And we have chosen to do that. So when we ask questions of ethics, we ask ourselves the basic question of ethics: is this reasonable? Questions of value: is this the way to live? And clearly we know that we can't live that. We need a system where we allow ourselves to support one another. For example, somebody has offered, I know a group of economists and philosophers who have proposed different ways of incentivizing production of pharmaceuticals that is based on not profits, but in regard to how innovations and things we do impact and impact poverty, eradication of poverty. We can choose. That's why it becomes an ethical question. We can make a choice. So citizens in the world, citizens in the North can make a choice because they're democratic places to do what is right. Governments also can make a choice. However, why is this tied to everything else that has been addressed? We can't have this kind of approach to life unless we address the fact that some are too powerful, some are too powerless. Somebody was asked, I think you may have read the book by Susan George, who asked, what should I do about this? And she said, study the rich and the powerful, not the poor and the powerless. Study how the rich make choices to go and invest in lobbying, billions of dollars in lobbying, influencing governments, influencing rules. Study how they influence businesses and how they, even these rules we're talking about trips, they look like they were made by governments. No, they were made by rich people. And through lobbying, they have become global rules that are guiding us. They are made from the perspective of incentivizing greed. But this can change. It can only change if we learn to ask all those critical ethical questions of value. Is this responsible? And I would like to end by going back to what, there was a question about, should we also not promote the agency of the poor? True. And this is a role that civil society and church groups and people like ourselves can do, because there is despondency in the South. People have given up on life because of too many problems, but we can bring them hope and remove the, the fatalism, and inform people, mobilize people to rise and realize that they can make a change. And we who work closely with people in civil society, in church groups, faith-based organizations, and others who work closely with people, we can do that. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you very much. What a fantastic way to end with these last comments from all of you. I feel totally energized, not only because there is so much to do, but to also know that here we are from different parts of the world, not only the panelists, but also the people who are with us. And that is a source of hope. And it's a source of strength. This feeling of connection, of we can do it, a capacity to work together for a better world, for a world of justice. I am deeply grateful to all of you, to all the panelists, including Dr. Sachs, who is no longer with us. I think it was an amazing combination of people. We heard so many different voices. There have been many comments about how you complemented one another. I am very grateful for your time. And I'm also grateful for all the people who have stayed with us, even though we ran way over time. And it shows that people are very interested in the topic. And I feel that there is a lot of work to do, and we will do it together. So a deep word of gratitude, and with many hopes for justice. And I also want to say thank you for the CJI team. We're a very small organization. We have a small team of 6 people, but they have put it all together. They're behind the scenes, and I'm very, very grateful to them for doing this. All the best to everyone, and thank you, and hope to see you at the next webinar. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you, Jenny. Thank you, CJI. Thank you, everybody.
Okay, bye-bye.